Let's start with number 1 Georgia taking on the Florida Gators. This game, of course, will be played in its traditional setting in Jacksonville, where Georgia is currently a 2-touchdown favorite, just north of that, 14.5, and the total sits at 49. This will be 3:30 Eastern time on CBS. Here's the one question I have, starting off with the underdog Florida Gators. Is the last 2 weeks an appropriate reflection of who this offense might ultimately be? Now, I understand who it was against the likes of Vanderbilt and South Carolina. Very different from what they're going to face on Saturday against the Georgia Bulldogs. But if you look at what they've done, I mean, the last 2 weeks, man, 76 points scored in their first 4 games against FBS competition. Well, the last couple games, it's been quite different. 79 points scored, and then, of course, nearly 500 yards of offense in the last 2 weeks. I think a big part of their success is that Graham Mertz is playing well. They obviously have been able to run the football a little better as well. And last week was some heroics. Of course, beating South Carolina was pretty remarkable. Back against the wall late, making some plays down the stretch, and stealing a victory there in Columbia, South Carolina. But here's one of the issues with Florida. While they have scored some points, they have manufactured some yards. Last outing against South Carolina, they allowed 27 quarterback pressures and 4 sacks, which Graham Mertz is, I think, a good player and has grown greatly. And for those that have jumped to conclusions about who he is and what he's capable of at Wisconsin, you need to watch the Florida version of Graham Mertz. He's actually quite a bit better. But I do think that he's not a guy that you want to rely on heavily when it comes to making the off-schedule play. That's not a winning recipe for them, especially against the Georgia Bulldogs. Florida has to be better on third downs in this game as well. Georgia is tremendous on third downs. That's to be expected. They almost always are. They allow just 24% conversions. That's the best in the FBS. Number 1, third down defense in college football. Florida struggles against pretty much everybody. There's 33% third down conversions. That's the second worst number in the SEC. So they have to be good in that part of the game, because if they're off schedule against Georgia, you get into third and longs, obvious passing situations. Georgia's going to sub in their speed rushers. They're going to sub in the guys that can really get after the quarterback. And then it's going to be very difficult for Florida to convert in those situations. Another big question in this game: what does Georgia look like without Brock Bowers? Obviously, without Brock Bowers, got hurt against Vandy, had surgery on October 16th. He leads the team by more than 200 receiving yards and was 5th in the FBS, regardless of position, with 415 yards after the catch at the time of his injury. 5th. He's a tight end, ladies and gentlemen. But to have over 400 yards after the catch, that's big play potential every single time. He's by far their best player. And while I love Carson Beck, and I think they have really good weapons, and we'll get to the weapons in just a minute, I still think Brock Bowers is a guy that when the game is on the line, just watch the Auburn game. When the game is on the line, they're looking in the direction of one guy. And without Brock Bowers against Auburn, would they have been victorious? I think that's a legitimate question to ask. Well, now they're without Brock Bowers. How do they fill the void? Oscar Delp is by far the most experienced tight end remaining on the roster. He'll probably get a decent amount of work, but he's really more of a pass catcher. Bowers is a little more versatile. Delp is kind of your traditional pass-catching tight end. So they will miss Bowers, his physicality and willingness to block in the run game, and they'll also miss his yards after the catch potential, because Delp has straight-line speed, but he doesn't have the wiggle that Bowers has. As far as the rest of the offense, hopefully Ladd McConkey's continuing to get a little bit more healthy, a little bit more comfortable. He's had the back injury all fall. Dominic Lovett is, I think, another guy in the slot, the transfer from Missouri, that could elevate his play. And then Ra Thomas, against Kentucky, he was terrific. And I do think Ra Thomas does have a really high ceiling. He's a big play threat every time he's on the field. So expect those 3 guys to take a step as far as the passing attack is concerned for Carson Beck. The other way that I think this is going to have to go, if Florida's going to pull the upset, they got to force a couple turnovers. And Carson Beck has been the tiniest bit susceptible the last couple games. He's thrown a pick in each of the last 3, and he'll have to clean that up moving forward. But if I'm Georgia, man, I just want to create some balance offensively. Because if you look at Georgia's run game for the better part of this season, yeah, they've had a bunch of injuries, right? We've documented that. Branson Robinson was lost during fall camp. Dejon Edwards has been by far their most consistent player, but he was out of the lineup the first couple of weeks. Kendall Milton's been hurt off and on throughout the first half of the season. Roderick Robinson hasn't played since week 3. So depth's been a huge issue at running back. And while Edwards has been very, very effective, without him, it's kind of hard to figure where this rushing attack might be. And you got to be balanced offensively, not to the extent which it's 200 yards passing, 200 yards rushing, and call it a day. Balance meaning in 2023, I mean, we're probably looking at 300 yards passing and 185 on the ground. That's decent balance. It's more about attempts than it is about actual yardage production. But in the event in which Edwards isn't effective, then you're looking at leaning on Dylan Bell, who's a kind of a wide receiver. That's who he is. And then Andrew Paul, who's a freshman, played very little at this point. So they got to take some of the pressure off Carson Beck in this game, because if you become one-dimensional against Florida, I think that can be a challenge. And then finally, will Ricky Pearsall go off? Went off against South Carolina in the last couple games, man. He has really, really been good. Didn't play great against Utah, had a couple drops in that game. But since that point, he has by far been the most reliable weapon for the Gators to complement what is a decent 1-2 punch at running back. Couple trends in this game. Georgia is 1-4 against the spread in their last 5 games as a double-digit favorite. Georgia is 0-7-1 in their last 8 games against unranked teams. And Florida is 4-1 against the spread in the last 5 games as a double-digit underdog. I'm not saying where I'd go, but if you listen to those trends, then it would indicate that Florida is going to keep this one close, and I think they will. I actually think Florida will hang in there a little bit, but Georgia's just too much. At the end of the day, I think Georgia gets away in the second half and ultimately beats the Gators in comfortable fashion. I'm not sure it's ever going to feel like Florida's going to win the game, but I would be surprised if they didn't have a good plan and they didn't battle from start to finish in this one.